Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with one other person. This week I am joined by Simon Winfield. Simon is the former CEO of Hayes Recruitment, one of my idols actually. Simon, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Michelle, nice to meet you. My name's, as you say, Simon Winfield. I'm the former CEO of Hayes in the UK and Ireland. Was with Hayes for 19 years in both the UK and Australia.
I mean, you've had an amazing career. I've tracked it on and off throughout my own career, actually, and you've had an amazing career. But one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you today was actually about recruitment. Some of the young graduates had reached out and they wanted to know whether I could do an episode on the AI and how that plays.
Right.
How that plays a part in them, the young graduates getting work, and how they can overcome getting their CV noticed.
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair question. I think it's not only does it seem now that everybody's CV is written using AI, particularly younger generations, but I think you've now got applicant tracking systems that are using AI to kind of long list potential candidates based on the algorithms it's using. I still think that if you write your own CV and particularly write your own covering letter or application form, it does tend to stand out. I used to scan the CVs of most of our graduates when we were doing our intern intakes and things like that. And you can tell that they didn't write them. They're all a little bit beige. And the ones where somebody has taken the time to personalize it, to write it themselves, particularly the covering letter as to why they want to work for you as a business, telling them about themselves, their motivations and those sorts of things do tend to stand out now, right? And I think if, I'm not suggesting you don't use AI. I think it could be very useful, particularly in research and those sorts of things. But I think when it comes to applying for jobs or trying to directly contact somebody, you've got to do it yourself, right? And I know it sounds daft, but that now stands out in this society that we live in. And so I'd encourage anybody applying for a job to take the time to actually write your own CV, write your own covering letter, and try and get to the person that ultimately is going to make the decision if you can. That's easier than it sounds because ultimately it disappears into a massive inbox of a recruiter somewhere. I think, I just mentioned to you as well, I think I'm interested with who's using AI. It feels to me like a lot of the recruitment business, certainly that I know and I'm in touch with, still take the time to manually review CVs, right? They don't use AI to do that. Whether that might change in the future, who knows? But it seems to me that the companies that are using AI are more the talent acquisition teams for some of the bigger corporate entities. Is it doing them any favors? Are they missing out on some people along the way? Are they doubling up and still kind of double checking manually? Maybe. I'm not, you'd probably have to talk to one of the big sort of talent acquisition guys in one of the big corporates. But I think the recruitment businesses are still doing it the old fashioned way and reading people's CVs in a manual fashion they always have and sort of long listing them based on their experience, right? But I think certainly whatever job you're applying for, I would encourage you to write your own CV. Again, like I say, don't not use AI to do the research, but write it yourself and certainly write your own covering letter.
Okay, but how do you, for anybody at any age, it's difficult to write a CV, especially a good one. What is your tips for them to do that?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of guidance as to how to write a CV. Should it be 2 pages? Should it be 4 pages? What's your personal profiles, qualifications, experience? It's got to be an accurate reflection of who you are, right? And I think that's where AI probably sort of dumbs things down a little bit because it sort of waters down who you are as an individual, right? I think as much of your personality, the experience you've had, whether it's at school or various sporting clubs or whatever it might be. I've got 3 kids, right? One's 14, one's 17, nearly 18, and the other one's 21. They've asked me similar questions. I remember writing Thomas's personal statement when he joined university. That was quite hard, right? And helping him do that. Because they've got limited life or work experience. But if you actually think about it, in the 18, 19, 21, 22 years that you've been on the planet, I'm sure there's a lot of work relevant things that you've been involved with that you should be able to get into your CV, right? And ultimately, when people are hiring graduates, they're hiring people based on potential, aren't they? They're not hiring people based on their experience. And you've got to find ways of expressing that potential to an employer, right? And I think employers are still super keen to know what you've done, what motivates you, what it is that you're looking for in a job, what future career aspirations and ambitions you've got, right? AI ain't going to cover that because AI doesn't know you, does it really? Right. So, you've got to be able to express those things in a CV, and a graduate should probably a couple of pages max, really. Right. I mean, even for a more experienced person, I think if you can get the right information in there and get somebody interested enough to want to have a conversation with you, then of course you can wax lyrical about the 20 or 30 years you might have had in your job. But I think it's getting things in there that are going to spark the interest of a potential employer. And I think most people, you like to think, if they're applying for a job, if they're taking it seriously, if they've done their research right on the organisation that they're applying to, right, you've got to think, and you take the fact that you're going to be hired on potential, not experience as a graduate, then make it your own, make it resonate who you are as a person. And like I say, your ambitions and aspirations and the experiences you've had, whether they're at school, clubs, whatever it might be, any work experience.
Okay, but maybe I was under the impression, or maybe a lot of the graduates as well were under the impression that a lot of the recruiters are using AI to sift through CVs. Is that not the case?
At a relatively low level, right? I don't think even some of the bigger recruiters are fully engaged with artificial intelligence in a way that you might think they are, right? I know my previous employer wasn't, right? And, I think, don't get me wrong, that's the kind of journey they're going on, and that's right. But I still think it is a case of you're reviewing CVs in the old fashioned way in many cases, even for graduates. I know a talent acquisition team, when we used to hire 50, 60 interns every year, they would go through every CV manually.
Okay, so a lot of recruiters still use the manual method.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, right?
Mm.
And there are some very whizzy gadgets out there doing, whizzy applications out there doing all sorts of interesting things. I'm not completely sure, and I might be being ignorant to this, but I'm not completely sure that anybody's got a piece of kit that fully goes through the process in a way a recruiter does to even longlist somebody, let alone shortlist anybody.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe they'll do it on geography or whatever the case might be, but no, not yet.
Do you think it'll ever change in the future?
I think it will change, but I think if there's a war on for talent, right, which everybody keeps talking about, companies, recruiters, it's going to have to be a pretty sophisticated piece of kit to make sure you don't miss anybody and people don't drop through the cracks.
Yeah, because that was one of my concerns, and I know that the graduates were concerning about as well, that there is this maybe fictitious AI piece of equipment that is maybe processing everybody's CV, and some might be missing out.
Now, AI algorithms only work on the basis of the data that you've given them, right? And they can categorize people based on certain criteria, types of qualification, for example, where you live, right? Relevant to any given job. But algorithms can only work on the basis of the data that you're giving them in the first place, right? So I think, like I say, there's a sifting process that, I know there are AI applications out there that are utilizing. But yeah, I'm not aware of any piece of kit that's replaced the oversight of a consultant in long listing or maybe long listing, right, based on geography or qualification or whatever it might be, but certainly not shortlisting suitable applicants. Definitely not.
Okay, so getting back to what you're saying, write your own CV. Are you a firm believer that you should have several CVs and tailor your CV to, it's probably a multiple question, and tailor your CV as per.
I think you should make your CV as relevant as you can to the job you're applying for sure. Yeah. And
Okay.
it depends how many different types of jobs you're applying for, right? And again, based on the basis of a graduate, you've got no work experience to tailor, if that makes sense,
Okay.
to any specific job. So you're probably only going to have one CV, which is all about you and your potential, right? And less about your work experience because you might not have any. So you're probably only going to have one. But I think you've got a core body of your CV, right? And if you're applying for jobs that are similar but in a narrow band of variance, right, there might be minor tweaks and changes you make to that CV, right, depending on the type of job you're applying for, the type of organization you're applying to. You can do that. I personally think what's more important, because a CV is just a CV, right? It's a faceless, largely faceless kind of summary of your experience, right? I have to say, I think the note you write on the application form or the letter you write that goes with your application is more important.
Okay, why is that then?
Because you've written it, right? That probably tells a recruiter far more about you as an individual than your CV does. Every time somebody gave me a CV, I asked for the covering letter to read it as well.
Okay.
Can somebody write? Are they articulate and eloquent? Right? Are they interesting? Because their CV typically is just, I live here, I went to this university or this school or this college, I played rugby, I played football, I was in the swimming team, whatever it might be. Great. Who are you? Right? And I think that covering letter is a chance to kind of, why are you applying for this job? What do you know about the company you're applying for? Do you know what I mean? We did a wonderful exercise. We had a skills and learning business. We used to take people from, we called it undiscovered talent, right? And we used to take people from disadvantaged backgrounds and give them opportunities that they'd never been able to access otherwise, right? So, a chance to retrain in technology, for example, in data or cybersecurity or software development or cloud. And these were people that, if they typically would have applied for those jobs to the organizations that were hiring for them, they wouldn't have got past first base because they had no relevant experience. But, you go back to this basis of potential. So, and I remember the first program we ever ran, the first academy program we ever ran, I think within 2 days, because we removed all the barriers to entry, we literally just posted this on, various job boards, social media platforms. And I think within 2 days, we'd had over 2,000 applications for it, right? And I think we had to shut the applications down after a week because we'd had something ridiculous, like 5,000, 6,000 applications. We interviewed 283 people in the end, or put through an assessment centre. And even getting to 283 was hard, right? And we said to people, you apply however you want. You can write to us, you can do a video, you can build a website. Tell us about who you are and why this is interesting to you. And honestly, some of the applications were quite humbling, right? And amazing. We had people doing videos and building websites just for this one job application. And it was awesome, right? And I think I didn't go through the whole process. I sat down with the guys and I looked at about 10 CVs. And the effort people had put in, the way they'd articulated themselves, their backstories around why this opportunity was important to them. I think I looked at about a dozen CVs. I think I'd have hired all of them. It was absolutely amazing, right? Did we get a few CVs? Yeah, but we didn't put people through an assessment centre or ultimately hire them based on their CV. We based on them on how they applied and their story. And a CV, I don't think, really tells your story.
Okay. That's an interesting concept. So it is very important to have a covering letter, because I know a lot of people that don't. They just send CV.
Yeah, if you're just sending a CV to a faceless kind of email address or whatever, through an applicant tracking system, don't be surprised if you don't hear anything.
Okay. Why is that then? Why is that?
I don't think sitting on the other end of that, it demonstrates that you've cared enough in that application. We used to hire 400 or 500 people a year just to work for the company I used to work for, right? And people would apply to us, and oftentimes with CVs and those sorts of things. And we put people through a 4 or 5 stage process, before we ultimately offered them a job. But I was always amazed. The first question I ever asked people when they sat in front of me was, have you looked at our website and what do you know about us? And you'd be amazed how many people hadn't and knew nothing.
Really? Because that would just be the basics.
Now, I'm sorry, that interview's now over, right? And, basic stuff, right?
It is.
They knew we were a recruitment business, but that was about it.
Okay. So it matters if you've been selected for an interview, it matters that you have to do your company research.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely right. Again, in your covering letter, why are you applying for the job? What is it about that job that appeals to you? Why is it that organisation is of interest to you? What is it you're aspiring to do? And why is this job therefore relevant to you? AI is not going to care, but the hiring manager probably will, right?
Mm.
I think in a society where it's too easy to click a button or use an algorithm to try and shortlist people, I actually think there's a fair degree of anti-AI sentiment out there,
You think so?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think people are skeptical of it, cynical of it, and I think there's a genuine concern that people are falling through the cracks because either they're not applying for jobs because they don't want to just end up in some algorithm somewhere, right? And I think even hiring managers are a little bit cynical about it too.
Okay. So do you really think that a lot of people are not going to apply for jobs and just in
Yeah,
case they're...
why would you? If you're just going to disappear into a black hole.
I have to admit, when I have been looking for work over the years, if it's direct to portal, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I don't.
If I was applying for a job today, I'd want to have direct access to the person that was going to interview me, either written or verbal.
And how would you go about doing that, even if you're maybe looking on LinkedIn or some of the other jobs boards? And
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is one way of doing it, right? And you can typically find out who works for these organizations, what their job title is, and all those sorts of things, right? And maybe if you know an organization's hiring, try and short circuit the, they might refer you back to, that particular job on this company website and apply there. But again, I think some of the hiring managers would love to hear from direct applications rather than what AI is presented to them.
okay, so if you see a job up,
Yeah, it's hard. It's harder to do than it is to say it, but it's doable.
do you think so? Because if you can get all the information off of LinkedIn, you could
Yeah,
maybe just contact the
yeah,
recruitment person directly.
yeah. You can do, yeah, for sure.
Is that
Absolutely,
better? Is that a better way rather than putting your CV on the pile?
definitely, definitely. And there's a lot of. I think the other thing that goes on at the moment, is in organisations trying to build their own sort of internal recruitment databases. There's a lot of applicant phishing that goes on for a possible job.
How do you know if that's one? Because there must be.
Oh, they won't tell you.
What?
But, I know people recently that have been for interviews, 2 or 3 interviews at cost, of travel or their own time or whatever the case might be, to then be told, oh, well, we'll get in touch with you when a project comes up. And at no point during that process was that the deal, right? They thought they were applying for a live job. And then they sort of kept on the hook and kept on the hook and kept on the hook on the basis of, wishful thinking by that organisation around what sort of work they're going to be winning in the future.
I mean, obviously, I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Go for it.
It's not better to wait then?
Not better to wait
No.
for what?
On what if you've had an interview and they promise you a job, it's not better to wait.
No, no, definitely not. Definitely not. By all means, be polite and by all means, see what happens. But if you're unhappy in your current role and looking for a new opportunity, keep looking. If they want you, they'll hire you.
And that is true, actually.
Right. And I do think in the world that we live in, and it might not feel like it at the moment because the economy in the UK, let's face it, is not exactly motoring along. But I do think candidates in the future have more control in the decision-making processes than the companies that want to hire them.
Do you think so? Because it
Yeah.
is quite hard. I know for a lot of people it is quite hard.
I know that doesn't feel like it at the moment, right? And it feels like there aren't enough jobs for the people that are looking for them. But I do think if the economy improves, I think candidates are in the driving seat.
I mean, I'm slightly older, a bit, and I mean, I've been through that times where it's been really boom. Do you think it'll ever go back to that?
Look, I think the UK economy's been pretty flat since we decided to leave Europe in 2016, right? I think there's been this sort of economic malaise that's kind of existed since then. I think up until that point, we were coming back from global financial crisis and the world felt pretty okay. But I think, once that decision was made, everybody went into sort of mild panic around what might happen. The economy stalled. The political landscape became a bit of a circus. COVID came along, which didn't help. There was that sort of bounce back post COVID where everybody thought, oh, this sort of feeding frenzy of hiring. But, that was just for people to kind of get the numbers back up to, maybe a third down on where they were pre-COVID. They'd lost so many people, and people were genuinely quite optimistic around what the future held, but the economy didn't support that. And that post-COVID bounce, ultimately a year later, a load of people got laid off again because this optimism that everybody felt coming out of that kind of very difficult situation didn't really manifest economically. And so far this government's done nothing to change that. So I think the economics in the UK have been pretty average for the last decade, maybe.
Oh, I think so too, actually. I do
Yeah.
think so too.
Yeah. And we've left Europe now. And if you were a big multinational global organization with money to invest, would you spend it in the UK? I don't know. Not convinced. Not unless we had an asset that you didn't have access to. You'd have to question what that might be.
So do you think that it's possible? I mean, I know that a lot of seniors and managers work abroad nowadays, but
Yeah.
is it possible for young graduates to get a foot in the door to go abroad?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I'm always fascinated and slightly jealous of the people that, live in Antigua and work for an organization in the US, particularly in the technology space. So they could work from anywhere and still do their job, right? So I do think there's opportunities for people to travel to work for organizations abroad, but also to have a slightly different work situation where geographical boundaries matter less than they probably used to. And you could fundamentally do a number of jobs now from anywhere in the world. Maybe not in construction, maybe not in healthcare and some of those sectors, but particularly in technology now, right? Anything to do with tech. Do you need to be physically present?
A lot of companies still want you to be. It's
A
always,
lot of, well, yeah, maybe they do, but I think some of the more enlightened ones, and particularly some of the technology teams, even within those organizations that would like people to be physically present, aren't, right? And people are scattered to the four corners of the world working for companies remotely and doing a pretty good job from what I see. But I think there will always be jobs where physical presence matters. Recruitment's one of them. I'm not convinced people will trust their career decisions and options to artificial intelligence.
you don't think so?
No, no, it's a big deal, isn't it? Moving house, getting married, getting divorced, changing job, right? It's a big deal. You want to talk to a human being.
I think so.
You want the counsel of a human being. You want the insight of that person that's met the customer, that's been to the offices, right? That understands the culture of that organization. You want informed guidance.
I do think so too. All them things that you just mentioned, it is a big change to happen
Yeah,
all.
they're human things.
Yeah.
They're human things, right? And changing jobs is a big deal for the vast majority of people. Maybe not some of the kind of lower level blue collar, if I can use that term, right? Sort of volume type jobs where temporary work is the norm and a 2 or 3 week assignment is pretty normal and people are used to that transient nature of that type of work. Maybe there is an automated, well, there already exists automated ways of doing that, or certainly automated ways of advertising those jobs and applying for those jobs and processing those people. There's typically a human still involved in that process somewhere. But even, high level fractional roles, interim roles, they're still a big deal for the people that do them. And they still want the security of this type of conversation.
Okay. I think I do agree with that as well.
Mm.
Right, I'm going to ask you another question.
Go for it.
What would your advice be to any new graduates coming into the energy space?
Oh, look, I think the energy sector is a fascinating. I've been very privileged to work within the sort of resources and mining sector, the energy sector, oil and gas, construction and property in my lifetime. And, I remember 15 years ago, we were talking about renewable energy and how it was coming. And, I think I think we were slightly caught out by the pace of it, if that makes sense, right? Because it didn't move as quickly as we thought it would.
Mm-hmm.
Biomass and solar and photovoltaic and wind energy and wave energy and all those sorts of things. And maybe it hasn't moved as quickly as everybody thought it might because governments weren't on board, right? But it now seems that the various governments and global governments around the world are on board with having to make those changes and the commitments they've made around clean energy, right? And there seems to be more progress probably in the last 5 years in renewable energy sources than there's ever been before. So, I think it's a really exciting space to be in. It's only going to get bigger, right? And I think if you're, I'm a bit of a technical bod as well. I love big yellow bits of kit and things that move and things that make things. So I think if you're that way engaged, then I think it's a great space to be in.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. It's, energy and how governments keep the lights on and provide the resources they need for their countries to continue to operate and grow in the way that they anticipate they will in a clean, globally responsible way is a big deal. Really big deal.
I think it is as well.
Yeah. And, I think even more so than maybe my or your generation, young people now are more environmentally and socially conscious than they've ever been about the sorts of organisations they work with, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think things like environmental consciousness and social consciousness matter to the generations that are now entering the workforce.
I think so too, actually. I do.
Whereas 20 years ago, maybe that wasn't so much the case. 50 years ago, it certainly wasn't.
Why do you think it's so changed now, though?
I think people are more aware of, the damage that we have done and are doing to the planet. I think it's more in people's faces now, whether that's social media or what that's caused that. And I think people are more thoughtful of what they perceive to be social injustice than they've ever been before.
Mm.
And I think, there's a generation entering the workforce now that don't want to be part of that. If anything, they want to be part of changing that. And we saw more engagement with volunteering programs and social programs and environmental programs from our younger group than we've ever seen before, right? And I think organisations need to be thoughtful about that, not just to tick some corporate governance box, but to keep engaged the people they're now employing and will be into the future.
I think so too, actually. That is quite important. It's really important.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of the younger generations of people are educating, our generations of people and tuning people into that. I've always been a big surfer and water sports and outdoors. And so I guess I've always had a consciousness around that and the ocean. But, I think as a boss of those generations of people, I've learned an awful lot more myself in the last decade and been acutely more aware of my responsibility in that as well.
I think so. I think we all have a responsibility to play in that.
Yeah, we do. We absolutely do. Yeah, we absolutely do.
Okay.
And particularly sitting in the UK in the middle of the second heat wave this year when you've got 30-degree temperatures and you're kind of going, where's this come from?
Yeah. It's quite hot, actually. Surprisingly for the UK. Yes, it is. Right, I'm going to wrap things up. That's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Simon for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening and see you next week.
Absolute pleasure to meet you and thanks for having me on.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.